This is the extensor carpi radialis. It's the first of four muscles in the craniolateral antebrachium that we're going to be covering. It is the most cranial of those four muscles. We know from the name that it's a carpal extensor. Extensor carpi, extensor carpus, extends the carpus. We also know that it's located on the radius, right? Extensor carpi radialis, the radius. In addition to being a carpal extensor, it's also an elbow flexor. It crosses both the elbow and carpal joints. And it's quite easy to palpate. When you come from the free surface of the radius, the radial bone here, and you move just cranially, you're going to be on the extensor carpi radialis here. So it is a superficial muscle. You can quite easily palpate here on the front of the radius. All three of the other muscles in the craniolateral antebrachium originate from the lateral epicondyle here on the humerus. But the extensor carpi radialis originates from the lateral epicondylar crest, just above it here on the radius, on the lateral side of the radius. You might also hear that called the lateral supracondylar crest. Both of those terms just refer to above or over. The brachioradialis isn't a very significant muscle in dogs. Often it will be missing, and when it is there, it's generally a very small muscle that doesn't do too much. But when it is present, it will also originate from the lateral epicondylar crest here, just a little bit proximal to the extensor carpi radialis. Extensor carpi radialis consists of two muscle bellies and also two tendons. As we move through this group, we'll see often the number of muscle bellies will correlate with the number of tendons, though not always. In the case of the extensor carpi radialis, it is two muscle bellies and two tendons here. These muscle bellies are partially fused and closely bound together. So from the epicondylar crest, this muscle crosses over the joint capsule of the elbow and moves cranially and distally and distends down the dorsal or cranial radius. In this case, the joint capsule itself is acting like a bursa, helping the extensor carpi radialis to slide over the elbow joint and reduce friction. There's also some fascia that's going to come from the medial side of the elbow, from the brachialis and the biceps brachii. And that's significant because those are the two other elbow flexors in the dog, or at least the most significant elbow flexors in the dog. So those muscles both send fascia over that connects to the extensor carpi radialis. And we can think about why that might be. It's going to create some connection and unity between the three main elbow flexors. Because extensor carpi radialis is probably the third most important elbow flexor in the dog, though the brachialis and the biceps brachii are really the two main elbow flexors that do almost all of the work. But having this connection to the extensor carpi radialis probably allows them to distribute some load onto the extensor carpi radialis. So there's a shared connection between these three muscles that helps them to spread out the load and put less strain on an individual muscle or tendon. And that just creates a more robust system of connective tissue here for elbow flexion in the dog. The extensor carpi radialis is often described as long, thick, and fleshy. And while it's not a huge muscle, it is a pretty long muscle. Some of the other muscles in this group do have a shorter muscle in relation to the tendon length, and the extensor carpi radialis has a higher muscle to tendon ratio, so that's probably why it's sometimes referred to as fleshy in some literature. Proximally up here, this muscle also has some fascial connection coming from the extensor digitorum communis, which is the muscle right behind it, just lateral to the extensor carpi radialis. So we see that pattern of fascia connecting muscles here continuing, really helping to help stabilize a lot of the muscles here on the cranial proximal radius. So the extensor carpi continues down the radius. Until about 2/3 of the way down the radius, it splits into two tendons that stay very closely together, tightly together. The extensor carpi radialis longus. If we separate this here, we can see the extensor carpi radialis longus is the more medial tendon, and the extensor carpi radialis brevis is the more lateral tendon. The extensor carpi radialis longus is going to go to the base of metacarpal 2, and the extensor carpi radialis brevis tendon is going to go to the base of metacarpal 3. The brevis tendon is a little bit larger, and the longus tendon is a little bit smaller. Put this back here. As they pass over the distal radius here, they're going to pass through the middle sulcus of the radius. That's that groove here. That's where the extensor carpi radialis is going to pass through. The more medial groove here, you can see it's a little bit darker here. That is the groove that the abductor pollicis longus tendon is going to pass through, which is a tendon that crosses over the extensor carpi radialis here. And the lateral sulcus here is going to house that extensor digitoris communis tendon that we talked about, the muscle here connecting with extensor carpi radialis proximally. You can palpate these tendons here at the carpal level. As these tendons pass over the carpal joint, they're going to be covered by the extensor retinaculum, which is basically just a band of fascia that helps keep these tendons in place as they cross over the dorsal carpus. Once these tendons pass over the intercarpal joint here, they're going to diverge, again with the extensor carpi radialis longus going to a small tuberosity at the base of metacarpal 2, and the extensor carpi radialis brevis going to a small tuberosity at the base of metacarpal 3. Remember that the base of the metacarpals is the more proximal part here that's going to be connecting to the distal row of carpal bones, and the head of the metacarpals will be down here connecting with the digits. Both of these tendons are going to have a tendon sheath that wraps over them and wraps them together. About half of dogs will have a tendon sheath that runs basically the entire length of the tendon, and some dogs will have varying lengths of tendon sheaths, generally just covering the carpal joint area when the tendon passes over the carpal joint. Often there will be a synovial bursa here underneath the tendon that will just help it to slide smoothly over the carpal bones. Like all the muscles in the craniolateral antebrachial group, the extensor carpi radialis is innervated by the radial nerve. So if you ever see a dog putting its paw down, knuckled down on its front limb, then that could be a radial nerve injury, because damage to the radial nerve would lead to a loss of carpal extension, which would lead the dog to put the paw down with the carpus flexed, walking on the dorsal surface of the carpus. The primary function of the extensor carpi radialis is carpal extension, but specifically when does it extend the carpus? Well, remember, it crosses the elbow joint here and plays a small role in elbow flexion. That means that when the elbow is extended, this muscle, the extensor carpi radialis, is elongated. So at that point in the late swing phase, when the shoulder is extending forward, the elbow is extending forward, this muscle is being stretched and elongated. So to maintain a reasonable length, the carpus must extend to shorten that muscle and tendon, because it's being elongated by the elbow extending. So the carpus flicking forward to prepare the paw for touchdown in the late swing phase is performed by the extensor carpi radialis. In fact, because a muscle and tendon, like the extensor carpi radialis, can only be stretched so far, this mechanism, this carpal extension in the late swing phase, happens even passively. That means even in a cadaver, if you extend the elbow, the carpus will extend as well. And it's the extensor carpi radialis that's responsible for this action. As I said, the extensor carpi radialis also contributes to elbow flexion to some degree. And this isn't surprising because it crosses the elbow joint on the cranial side, but it isn't a significant role. One study said the extensor carpi radialis flexes the elbow during the swing phase of gait, but only when the dog is walking. And when the dog speeds up and transitions to a trot or a gallop, this muscle activity goes away. The extensor carpi radialis also plays a role in stabilization. They did a study on cadavers where they looked at what structures limited elbow flexion and elbow extension. Elbow flexion has a hard bony stop. At least in a real dog skeleton, it has a hard bony stop. In this model, it seems to just move around loosely. But in a real dog, there's a hard bony stop that limits elbow flexion. But elbow extension is more complicated. As you start to cut structures away, in like a dog cadaver, then elbow extension increases. When the extensor carpi radialis muscle was cut, elbow extension increased by 5.5 degrees in greyhounds and 3.9 degrees in other breeds. So this is one of the largest increases that occurred after removing a structure. So the extensor carpi radialis is one of the key structures stabilizing the elbow and limiting elbow extension. If you were curious, the deep fascia is actually the number one limiter of elbow extension in the dog. And the extensor carpi radialis also stabilizes the carpus during extension as well. While not commonly reported, myofascial trigger points have been found in the extensor carpi radialis. This isn't really surprising. It is the main carpal extensor, and it has these fascial connections coming from the brachialis and the biceps, which means it could be absorbing a lot of its own forces, but also taking some load from some of those other associated muscles. Before we go, let's just review the anatomy one more time. So the extensor carpi radialis is going to be starting here from the lateral epicondylar crest. It's going to be passing over the joint capsule of the elbow, descending down the dorsal or cranial radius here. As it comes down, it's going to be passing through this groove here, the middle sulcus of the radius, crossing over the carpal joint, obviously on the dorsal side here. It's going to be held in place by the extensor retinaculum. This band of fascia is going to be holding these tendons in place. And the tendons are going to diverge at this intercarpal joint level. And the smaller extensor carpi radialis longus tendon is going to go to the small tuberosity at the base of metacarpal 2. And the slightly larger extensor carpi radialis brevis tendon is going to go to the small tuberosity here at the base of metacarpal 3. So this has been a pretty in-depth review of the extensor carpi radialis muscle. If you have any questions or comments, please put them in the comments. I'll be back next week with the extensor digitorum communis muscle, sometimes called the common digital extensor, as we start to work our way through the craniolateral antebrachium. Thanks for watching.